Welcome back, or welcome for the first time if tonight is the night you found this channel. Either way, I'm glad you're here. Go ahead and get yourself comfortable. Pull the blanket up, adjust the pillow, turn the brightness down a little if you haven't already. We're going to be here for a while, and that's exactly the idea. Tonight we're doing something a little different from the usual. We're going to take one of the most watched, most argued about, most genuinely beloved television shows of the last 2 decades, and we're going to sit with it for a while. Not to debate whether it was good or whether it went off the rails or whether the finale was satisfying. That's a different conversation for a different night. Tonight we're just going to look at the characters, the people, the ones who've been living rent-free in the heads of millions of viewers since 2010, and who, if certain fan theories are to be believed, were never quite who the show told us they were. The Walking Dead ran for 11 seasons, 177 episodes. It spawned 6 spin-off series that are still ongoing as of the time I'm recording this. It generated more cultural conversation, more fan theory forums, more Reddit threads, and fan wikis and midnight rewatches than almost any other drama series in cable television history, which, considering it started as a story about a man waking up alone in a hospital, is genuinely a bit remarkable. And in all of that conversation, in all of those forums and wikis and threads, something started to accumulate. Evidence, not fan fiction, not wishful thinking, but real specific evidence, pulled from real specific episodes and real specific pieces of dialogue that suggested the characters we were watching were more complicated and darker than the story was letting on. Part of what makes The Walking Dead such fertile ground for this kind of theory is the sheer volume of canonical material available. When a show runs for that long, when you have over 700 minutes of a single character's screen time across a decade of production, you accumulate details that the writers put in deliberately and details that got in by accident, and the fans who spend their evenings going back through old episodes cannot always tell which is which, nor, frankly, can the writers. A story that runs that long acquires meaning in ways that no single writer's room could fully intend or predict. The theories that emerge from that process are, at their best, genuine close readings, the kind of textual analysis you'd apply to a novel or a film, applied instead to several hundred hours of television and producing, inevitably, a reading that is richer and stranger than the show itself might have bargained for. That's what tonight is about. We're going to go through 8 of the show's major characters: Rick Grimes, Shane Walsh, Daryl Dixon, Carol Pelletier, Negan, Morgan Jones, Michonne, and the Governor. 2 theories per character, 16 theories in total. Some of these are theories you've probably heard before, floating around in various corners of the internet. Some of them are a bit more obscure. All of them are grounded in things that actually happen in the show. Specific scenes, specific lines of dialogue, specific choices that, when you hold them up to the light a certain way, cast shadows in directions you weren't expecting. None of these theories are presented as the definitive truth about these characters. That's not what this is. This is more like sitting with a show you love and letting yourself follow one particular thread all the way to wherever it leads, and then following another, and then another, until you've built up a picture of a fictional world that's a little stranger and a bit more unsettling than the one on the surface. If you enjoy this kind of content and you haven't already subscribed, now would be a lovely time to do that. It's completely free, and it genuinely does help the channel more than I can adequately express. Anyway, that's enough of that. Right, let's begin at the beginning, which means, as it almost always does with The Walking Dead, it means talking about a man lying in a hospital bed. There's something that often gets overlooked about The Walking Dead's opening sequence, and I think it's worth pausing on for a moment before we get into anything else. The very first image we get, not of the apocalypse, not of walkers, not of Atlanta burning, is a child, a little girl in pink pajamas walking across a petrol station forecourt, dragging a stuffed rabbit along the ground behind her. Rick approaches her, cautiously, because the world is already clearly wrong, and when she turns, she's a walker, and he shoots her. The show opens with an adult killing a child. That's not a small creative choice. The show is telling you, right at the start, that whatever story you're about to watch is not going to honour the rules you think it should. The rules about who deserves protection, about who counts as innocent, about what a hero is allowed to do and still be called a hero. Right there, in the very first minute, the show plants its flag. I think about that image a lot when I think about the theories we're going to discuss tonight, because all of them, in one way or another, are asking the same question that the show was asking in that opening shot, which is, when is a person still a person? When do survival instincts stop being instincts and start being choices? And what does it mean to be the protagonist of a story that keeps doing things a protagonist should not be allowed to do? The Walking Dead was always more interested in those questions than it let on, and the fan theories, the good ones anyway, are just people following those questions wherever they lead. Part of what makes these particular theories worth examining, rather than just entertaining, is that they are not wildly implausible. They don't require you to believe something that contradicts the show's established facts. They require you to believe that the show's established facts, taken together, support a reading that the show itself didn't explicitly endorse. Which is, when you think about it, true of the best literary analysis generally. You're not inventing, you're noticing. So, Rick Grimes, let's start there. Here's what we know for certain, as a matter of the show's established canon. Rick Grimes is a sheriff's deputy in King County, Georgia. He gets shot during a chase, takes a bullet in a gap in his vest, and falls into a coma in the hospital. He is unconscious when the world ends. He wakes up alone in a hospital room that has clearly been abandoned for some time. The flowers his partner Shane brought are dead and wilted. The machines are off. The clock has stopped. The building is overrun. The show presents this as the inciting incident of the entire franchise. Rick wakes up, finds the world destroyed, and goes looking for his family. That's the story. Except there is a version of this, a theory that's been circulating since roughly the second season of the show, that argues Rick did not, in fact, wake up. That what we've been watching for 11 seasons across 177 episodes is the dream of a man still lying in that hospital bed. That the coma never ended. That the world inside Rick's head ran on and on and on, while the real world did whatever the real world was doing without him. Now I know how this sounds. Every long-running show gets a "they were in a coma the whole time" theory at some point. It's become a bit of a cliché. But hear me out, because the evidence here is more specific and more genuinely troubling than the usual version of this kind of thing. Start with the most practical problem. Rick survives in that hospital for what the show implies is at least several weeks, possibly longer, possibly months. He is in a medically induced coma. He has no IV fluids, no nutrition, no water. In the real world, a person in a coma without intravenous support begins to deteriorate within days. The kidneys fail. The body consumes itself. By the time Rick wakes up looking merely thin and confused, he should by any reasonable medical measure be dead, or at minimum severely and permanently damaged in ways the show never acknowledges. The show attempts to address this a little. There's a theory within the show itself, the generator timeline, which suggests the hospital was functioning until just days or hours before Rick woke up, and that staff were tending to patients right up until the very end of the collapse. And that's plausible, sort of, except that the visual evidence of the hospital when Rick walks through it contradicts this. The decay is not days old. The bodies are desiccated. The building has been abandoned for long enough that the infrastructure has deteriorated significantly. The timeline doesn't quite hold together, which leaves two options. Either the show made a mistake and we're meant to overlook it, or the show made a mistake because its internal logic is dream logic, and dream logic doesn't have to be consistent. Because the Walking Dead that Rick wakes into is, in the early episodes, a relatively grounded world. The rules of the apocalypse are established carefully. Walkers behave in predictable ways. Human conflicts follow comprehensible escalation. The Season 1 camp at the quarry feels like something that could plausibly happen. People are resourceful, frightened, and mostly rational. Then the show continues. And somewhere in the middle season, not all at once, gradually, the world starts operating on a different kind of logic. Rick bites through a man's carotid artery with his bare teeth in the Season 4 finale and walks away from it having barely processed what he's done. He and his group slaughter their way through Terminus, a functioning community, and the show presents it as heroism. The conflicts escalate to a scale and a spectacle that no longer quite fits the grounded world of the early seasons. Entire civilizations rise and fall in the span of a few episodes. Now, you could explain this as the natural drift of a long-running show. The writers push further as the seasons progress because they need to keep things interesting. That's true of virtually every long-running drama. But the coma theory offers a different explanation. The world is becoming more surreal because the dreaming mind is becoming less able to hold the scaffolding together. Early in the coma, Rick's subconscious constructed something coherent, something that felt like a story with rules. But dreams don't stay coherent. The longer they run, the more the logic shifts, the more the impossible starts happening without anyone remarking on it. There's also the CDC sequence, Season 1, Episode 6. Rick and the group find the CDC still functioning, staffed by a single scientist named Edwin Jenner, who has been working alone since the collapse. Just before the building destroys itself, Jenner whispers something in Rick's ear, something that changes Rick visibly, breaks something in him that he carries for several seasons before finally telling the group. The secret is that everyone is already infected. Everyone carries the virus. Death means becoming a walker regardless of whether you've been bitten. In the dream reading, this detail takes on a different weight. Rick's subconscious constructed that revelation, gave it to a scientist in a secret whisper, like information that the dreamer already knows is true, but can't bring himself to say aloud in the daylight. The revelation isn't something Rick learned. It's something Rick's dreaming mind inserted into the narrative, because on some level, he already understood it. His brain already knew the ending. I've seen this theory dismissed by the showrunners. Kirkman denied it in a tweet not long after the show began. Scott Gimple addressed it directly ahead of The Ones Who Live's premiere, saying, with a kind of affectionate exasperation, that Rick is awake, it's really happening. That's not a spoiler. And fair enough. But here's the thing about that kind of denial. It tells you what the creators intended. It doesn't tell you what the text contains. The evidence in the episodes exists regardless of authorial intent. Kirkman didn't intend the coma theory to be true. But the hospital timeline is still there, and the escalating unreality is still there, and the dream logic is still there. You can deny the theory without removing the evidence that produced it. And if it is true, there's something quietly devastating about it. The entire story, all of it, the farm and the prison, and Alexandria and all the rest, is a man lying in a bed, constructing a world in which his family survived, in which he was the hero, in which love and sacrifice and human stubbornness were enough to hold the darkness back, which is, in its own strange way, one of the most human things imaginable. We all build the world we need when the real one gets too difficult to bear. There's one more element to this that I don't see discussed as often as the others, and I think it's worth raising. The show has a recurring motif, not always foregrounded but consistently present, of Rick speaking to people who aren't there. He has a telephone in the prison period, Season 3, where he spends several episodes conducting conversations with voices on the end of a disconnected line. The voices turn out to be hallucinations of dead people. Laurie, Amy, Jim, Jackie. The show frames this as grief-induced psychosis, and eventually Rick recognizes it and moves forward. It is one of the show's more explicitly psychological storylines. But in the coma reading, these conversations become something else. They are the dreaming mind inserting voices from the real world the real hospital room, the real voices of people speaking to a man in a coma, into the fabric of the dream. The calls that come from people who have died inside the dream are the brain processing the sound of voices from the room it cannot fully reach. The detail that makes this particularly striking is that the voice most clearly heard, the voice Rick recognizes as his grief-given form, is Laurie, his wife, the person most likely to be at his bedside, the person most likely to be talking to him, reading to him, holding his hand. She is there in the real room. He just can't reach her. His dreaming mind puts her voice on a telephone in a prison because that is the only way the narrative he's constructed knows how to receive her. I am aware that this kind of reading requires a significant amount of charitable interpretation, but that's what the good fan theories are at their best, not proof, possibility, a thread to pull on gently that leads somewhere the show's official narrative doesn't quite accommodate and doesn't quite deny. This one makes people uncomfortable, which is usually a sign it's worth sitting with. Rick Grimes is the show's protagonist, the hero, the man who woke up and found the world destroyed and spent 11 years fighting to protect the people he loved and rebuild something worth living in. That's the story the show tells. It's a good story. It's the reason 17 million people were watching on Sunday nights at the height of the show's popularity. But if you take the same events and remove the framing, if you look at what Rick actually does, rather than how the show frames what he does, a different picture emerges, a considerably darker one. Let's start with the basic arithmetic. Rick Grimes kills more living human beings across the run of the show than most of the characters the show designates as villains. Not walkers, people, survivors, many of whom are doing exactly what Rick is doing, trying to stay alive, trying to protect their communities, making decisions that their circumstances demanded. The Claimers in the Season 4 finale. Rick bites through Joe's carotid artery and lets him bleed out on the road. The show frames this as necessary. Rick had no weapon. Carl and Michonne were in danger. And that's true. What's also true is that the Claimers were a community, harsh and brutal by any normal standard, but a community nonetheless, with rules and loyalty structures. Rick annihilated them. Terminus. The people of Terminus were cannibals. That's the show's justification for what Rick and the group do there. They lured and ate survivors, and they needed to be stopped. But the show also tells us, in the episode A and in later dialogue, that the people of Terminus were once ordinary survivors who had constructed a genuine sanctuary, who had hung signs offering safety and community, who had been overrun by violent men and had what was done to them systematically done to them for a prolonged period of time. What they became was a direct result of what was done to them. Rick didn't investigate any of this. He didn't look for alternatives. He walked into a room of people who had been historically victimized, and he executed them. But the moment that has always struck me as the most revealing is not a violent one. It's a line of dialogue. Season 2 finale, after Shane's death, when Rick is exhausted and frightened and done with consensus and done with argument, he turns to the group and says quietly, "This is not a democracy anymore." Think about that. Think about where that philosophy leads. Follow it forward, not backward. That sentence, said by Rick Grimes, the hero, in an emotional state that the show invites you to sympathize with, is the founding document of every tyrannical community the show will spend the next 8 seasons presenting as Rick's enemies. The governor says it with a different name and more elaborate violence, but the underlying logic is identical. Negan says it with a baseball bat wrapped in barbed wire. Rick said it first. The governor parallel is the one the show draws most explicitly, and it's worth taking seriously. In Season 3, Rick and the governor meet and negotiate, and the show asks quite directly whether these two men are different in kind or only in degree. Both men have built communities. Both men have used extreme, sometimes horrifying violence in defense of their people. Both men believe utterly in their own righteousness. The governor's cruelty is more theatrical, his body count of innocence is higher, his methods are more sadistic, but the philosophical architecture is the same. Rick Grimes is not a villain in the way the governor is a villain. He is something more interesting than that, and I think more unsettling. He is a good person who, placed in circumstances where there was no accountability, where the legal structures and social contracts that normally constrain human behaviour had simply evaporated, became steadily more willing to do things that those structures existed to prevent. Not because he was corrupted, not because he lost himself, but because the apocalypse revealed what was always latent, that given sufficient justification, given sufficient love for the right people, and sufficient fear for their safety, Rick Grimes was capable of almost anything. There's a particular Season 5 episode, Try, where Rick confronts Pete Anderson, an abusive man in Alexandria. By drawing his gun in the middle of the street and screaming at the community, the Alexandrians, who have not seen what Rick is capable of, are frightened. Not of Pete, of Rick. They lock themselves inside their houses and look at him through their curtains, and the show very carefully frames this as the community's failure to recognise Rick's good intentions. But if you watch the scene without that framing, if you watch it as a neutral observer, you see a man in the middle of a neighbourhood street brandishing a firearm and screaming, and the people locking their doors and watching through windows are having the entirely correct response. Rick is right about Pete. Pete is dangerous. The situation needs to be resolved. But the way Rick handles it, the explosion of it, the complete bypassing of any community process, the immediate escalation to weapons-drawn confrontation, is not the behaviour of a community member raising a concern. It is the behaviour of someone who has decided that his assessment of the situation is definitively correct, and that the only relevant question is enforcement. The rest of the community's opinion is an obstacle. The show is asking you to see this as Rick at his most Rick. His instincts are correct. His methods are excessive. He is essentially fine. The theory asks you to sit with the fact that those two things, correct instincts, excessive methods, a conviction that his judgment supersedes community process, are precisely the profile of every dangerous authority figure the show has ever depicted. The difference is that Rick's people love him, which is not historically the most reliable indicator that the authority is being exercised well. The show knows this. It keeps asking you to think about it. Morgan says it to him directly. Herschel says it. Gabriel says it. The show places character after character in Rick's path specifically to voice the concern that he is going too far, becoming too much, losing the distinction between protection and predation. And each time, Rick makes a choice that the show asks you to accept as necessary and moves on. He is the Walking Dead of the title as much as any walker. A man who died, morally, psychologically, and continued walking, just with better aim and a cleaner narrative. What gives this theory weight beyond the obvious observation that the protagonist does bad things is the show's treatment of the people around Rick who notice the same pattern. Herschel Green is the character most consistently positioned as Rick's moral counterweight. He pushes back. He asks the hard questions. He provides the friction that reminds Rick and the audience that the decisions being made are not cost-free. And the show kills Herschel, specifically, publicly, as the governor's first act of war against the prison. The person most committed to holding Rick accountable is removed from the narrative at the moment when the narrative needs someone to hold him accountable most. Morgan serves a similar function in later seasons. Dale serves it earlier. Gabriel serves it mid-run. The show cycles these moral voices in and out of Rick's story, and they all end the same way: removed, killed, or marginalized. The people who stay, the people the show rewards with survival across the full run, are the ones who accept Rick's framework, who operate within his moral logic, even when it makes them uncomfortable. The ones who push back hardest are consistently the ones who don't make it. That is not an accident in a show about how good people are shaped by terrible circumstances. That is the story being told. The protagonist's moral framework is self-reinforcing because it keeps eliminating the people who challenge it. By the end, Rick's group is a community of people who have all at various points chosen to do things that the first season's versions of themselves would not have recognized as heroism, which is the story of an apocalypse. And also, if you're following this particular thread, the story of an unaccountable man who outlasted everyone who might have made him better. The Ones Who Live, the spin-off, gives Rick a final arc that is, depending on how you read it, either a genuine reckoning or a very long justification. He spends years in CRM captivity trying to rebuild himself from the outside in, constructing a version of himself that can operate within their system, while simultaneously protecting what he cares about. He eventually succeeds. He escapes. He returns to Michonne. He is, in the spin-off's resolution, presented as a man who found his way back to himself. But the question the theory leaves you with is, which self? The man who came out of the coma in season 1 with the cowboy hat and the moral clarity? Or the man who bit through someone's throat in a car park, who ordered executions, who said, "This is not a democracy anymore," and meant it from the depths of his chest? Both versions are Rick Grimes. The show spent 11 years showing you both, and never quite settling which one was the real one. Maybe that is, in the end, the most honest thing a show about survival can say. The real one is both. The real one was always both. The apocalypse didn't create the darkness or the light. It just made it impossible to keep them in separate rooms. Shane Walsh is dead by the end of season 2. He's been dead for years now in the show's timeline, decades by the point the spin-offs are set, and yet the conversation about him never quite seems to settle. People still argue about Shane with a particular kind of intensity that the show's later villains, the Governor, Negan, all of them, somehow don't generate in quite the same way. And I think that's because the Shane argument is, underneath everything else, an argument about the show's moral framework, about whether the story was being honest with you. John Bernthal's performance is a large part of why Shane refuses to stay buried in the cultural memory of the show. He plays Shane as a man who is fully aware of what he's doing and fully aware of what it costs. And that specific combination, intelligence and self-awareness in service of choices the audience is invited to judge negatively, makes him uncomfortable in ways that a straightforwardly villainous character wouldn't be. You can dismiss a monster. Shane you have to argue with, and arguing with a dead fictional character across multiple seasons of a television show is, in its own way, the clearest possible evidence that the character was real in the ways that matter. Let me walk through this carefully, because the version of Shane you get if you're watching casually is a man who slides from loyal friend in a crisis into jealous obsessive into would-be murderer, and the show frames each of those transitions as character degradation, as Shane becoming less, as the apocalypse stripping away the civilized layers and revealing something ugly underneath. And that reading isn't wrong. Shane does become dangerous. Shane does cross lines. By the end, Shane is planning to kill Rick, and the show wants you to see that as confirmation of everything it's been suggesting about him. But here's what gets overlooked in that framing. Almost every specific prediction Shane made about the situation, about what survival required, about what was going to get people killed, about what Rick's approach would cost them, turned out to be correct. Take the farm. The group finds the green farm in season 2 and spends an entire season settled there, semi-peacefully, growing attached. Shane argues loudly and persistently that the farm is not safe, that they cannot stay indefinitely, that the walls, or rather the absence of walls, the openness of the property, make it fundamentally indefensible. Rick resists this. Herschel resists this. The group digs in emotionally, and the farm becomes home. The farm is overrun at the end of season 2. People die in the evacuation. They lose the safety and the resources the farm represented in exactly the circumstances Shane predicted. Then there's Randall, a young man from another group who the group captures and then debates endlessly about what to do with. Shane says kill him. The argument is blunt and uncomfortable. Randall's group is dangerous. Randall knows the farm's location. Releasing him or keeping him both represents unacceptable risks, and the only option that guarantees the group's safety is to eliminate the variable. Rick can't do it. The group agonizes. They eventually release Randall, and then Shane kills him anyway, in a way that goes badly. But more importantly, Randall's original group later appears and causes exactly the violence Shane was trying to prevent. And then there is the larger argument, the one Shane keeps making in different forms across the whole second season, about Rick's attachment to the ethics of the old world. Rick keeps trying to apply rules that were designed for a world with courts and police and consequences. Rules about when it's acceptable to use violence, about the value of mercy, about the rights of strangers. Shane's argument is not that those rules were wrong in the old world. His argument is that those rules are not functional in this world, and that Rick's insistence on maintaining them is going to cost the people around him their lives. The show spent 9 more seasons after Shane's death proving him right. Not about everything. Not about the personal choices, the affair, the murder attempt, but about the strategic and tactical and philosophical arguments. He was right. The old world's rules didn't apply. Mercy towards the wrong people repeatedly got people killed. Sentimentality towards places and communities repeatedly led to catastrophic losses. Shane saw what the world had become. Rick spent years trying to pretend it had become something else. And the audience, having watched those years, is left with the uncomfortable knowledge that the man the show killed as its first human villain was, on the merits, more consistently correct than the man it held up as its hero. That's not a comfortable thing. I don't think the show meant for it to be comfortable. I think it meant for the audience to sit with the tension and not resolve it cleanly. But the evidence is there, and once you see it, you don't unsee it. And there's a specific detail in the way Shane is written that I think the theory is right to latch onto. Shane is the only character in the show's early seasons who gives the audience his full reasoning. He doesn't hide his logic. When he argues for leaving the farm, he explains exactly why. When he argues for killing Randall, he lays out the risk assessment step by step. He treats the adults around him as capable of following an argument, and he makes the argument, even when he knows they're not going to like it. This is not the behaviour of a man who has lost his moral compass. This is the behaviour of a man who is confident enough in his reasoning to present it openly and let the group decide. Rick, by contrast, operates increasingly through implication and through decision by fait accompli. He makes the call and then tells people what happened. The difference in style, Shane transparent and argumentative, Rick increasingly opaque and decisive, is the show's attempt to distinguish them. And it works, visually and narratively. But the transparency is arguably the more honest approach. Shane is telling you what he's doing and why. Rick is often just doing it and asking for your trust. The tragedy is not that Shane was wrong. The tragedy is that being right and being honest about being right and being unable to mask the personal costs of the situation, the love for Laurie, the attachment to Carl, the genuine grief about Rick, all combined to produce a man who looked dangerous and probably was dangerous in specific narrow respects, but who was also the person in the group most clearly looking at the world as it actually was. And that person is the first human casualty of the show's protagonist. This one requires a bit more care because it touches on some genuinely sad territory. But stay with it, because the evidence is there in the show in ways that are hard to dismiss. By the time Rick wakes up in that hospital, by the time he emerges from the coma and starts making his way through the ruins, Shane and Laurie have been living together at the quarry camp for a couple of months. The affair happened because Laurie believed Rick was dead. Shane told her so. Whether that was a lie of omission or a genuine belief on Shane's part is one of the show's deliberately unresolved questions, but it doesn't entirely change what followed. What followed was that Laurie and Shane formed a domestic unit, and that within that domestic unit, Shane became a daily presence in Carl's life in ways that Rick, working long shifts before the apocalypse and emotionally somewhat absent even when home, had not quite managed. The show gives us evidence of this. Early in Season 1, in the quarry camp, we see Shane teaching Carl to tie knots, teaching him practical skills, patiently, attentively, in the way that a person teaches a child something when they're genuinely present and not distracted. There's a scene where Shane gives Carl a haircut and jokes with him about shaving, and Carl is comfortable with him, relaxed, the easy body language of a kid with a familiar adult rather than a kid performing good behaviour for a relative who stopped by. Rick's relationship with Carl, particularly in the early seasons, is warmer, but also more fraught. There's love there, obviously, but Rick arrives late to a situation that has already been shaped by 6 months of Shane filling a role. He is catching up to a family that has reorganised itself in his absence. He is the returning father figure, competing, however unconsciously, with the man who is actually there. And then there is the pregnancy. Laurie tells Rick about the baby sometime in Season 2, and she also tells him, with evident discomfort, that the baby might be Shane's. The math is ambiguous. The show doesn't resolve it definitively. Rick accepts the child regardless, takes on paternal responsibility immediately, completely, without condition. Judith is raised as Rick's daughter. She carries his name, but the theory holds that Shane was the biological father. And the evidence is not just the timeline, though the timeline is genuinely ambiguous. It's also the way the show handles the moment of revelation. Laurie clearly believes it's possible. She says so. Shane's behaviour around the pregnancy, the intensity of his reaction, the way he processes the news, the complicated grief that runs through his later actions, is consistent with a man who believes he's the father and cannot claim that in any way that doesn't destroy everything. Shane dies in Season 2. He never meets his daughter, or rather, he never knows the child he helped create was born, survived, and grew up to be one of the show's most capable survivors. A child named for someone else, raised by the man who killed him, who carries, and this is the part that gets me, who carries Shane's instincts. Judith is decisive. Judith is pragmatic. Judith has the kind of tactical clarity about when to act and when to wait that Rick always wanted and Shane always had. If she's Shane's daughter, that's not coincidence. That's inheritance. And the story would be that the man the show killed, as its cautionary tale, left the best version of himself behind, in a child who will never know that's what she is. There is a small, easy-to-miss detail in a Season 2 episode that the theory uses as its most specific piece of evidence. When Laurie finally tells Rick about the pregnancy and the possibility that the baby is Shane's, Rick's response is careful and measured and deeply loving. He says it doesn't matter. He says the baby is theirs. He says he will raise this child regardless. And Shane's response when he learns Laurie is pregnant, when he first hears the news, is a rage that is specifically disproportionate if the child is not his. His reaction is not the reaction of a man who's been told that the woman he loves is having someone else's baby. It is the reaction of a man who has just learned that the situation he cannot claim publicly has produced a consequence he cannot manage. Shane never stops believing Judith is his. That's the theory's core. He dies believing it. And the grief underneath his final weeks, the specific desperation, the escalating willingness to destroy everything around him, is partly the grief of a man watching the child he believes is his being taken away before it's even born, into the care of a man he has already decided has to die. The murder attempt is not just about Laurie, it is about Judith, the child who doesn't have a name yet, the child Shane never got to meet. One thing that gets somewhat lost in the Shane conversation is the specificity of his grief. And I mean grief in the most literal sense, not metaphor, before Rick came back. Before Laurie told Shane that Rick was alive, Shane Walsh had already done the thing that the apocalypse most consistently asks of its survivors. He had accepted the death of someone he loved and built a new life around that acceptance. He told Laurie that Rick was dead. Whether he genuinely believed it or whether he lied, the practical reality is identical. Shane processed Rick's death, constructed a domestic life with Laurie and Carl in the chaos of the early outbreak, and became, functionally, emotionally, practically, the head of that family. He did the hard thing. He moved forward. He didn't get stuck in the way that Morgan would later get stuck. He adapted. And then Rick walked out of the woods at the quarry camp, alive. And everything Shane had built, the relationship, the role, the future he was constructing, evaporated. Not because Rick did anything wrong, not because Shane had done anything wrong, just because Rick was alive. Because the world had failed to stay in the shape Shane's decisions had assumed it would hold. The show frames Shane's subsequent deterioration as jealousy and obsession, and those are fair words for some of what follows. But the grief underneath it, the specific grief of a man who did the work of accepting a loss and moving on, and then had that work retroactively cancelled, is something the show never quite names directly. You can do everything right. You can process it, adapt to it, build something real from the wreckage, and the universe can simply undo it. Retroactively, without asking. Shane's anger at Rick isn't just about Laurie, it's about how arbitrary the whole thing was. His choices, his willingness to adapt, his insistence on looking at things clearly, none of it was enough. The world didn't care about any of that. Rick woke up, and Shane's version of events became the wrong one. Retroactively rewritten as the villain's version, the jealous man's version. When from where Shane was standing, he had simply been right about the wrong thing at the wrong time. There's an argument to be made that Shane Walsh is the show's most quietly tragic figure, precisely because his tragedy is not operatic. He didn't lose his mind. He didn't lose his family. He lost his place in a story that had already been written around him without his knowledge. And that kind of loss, the loss of a narrative role you didn't know you were occupying, is one that the apocalypse genre almost never thinks to examine. The Walking Dead examined it once, briefly, through Shane Walsh, and then moved on. Daryl Dixon is, by most measures, the character who came to define the franchise more than any other. He wasn't in the original comics. He wasn't planned as a long-running character. He was meant to be a minor antagonist figure who would be written out early on. What happened instead is that Norman Reedus gave a performance that resonated so deeply with audiences that the show restructured itself around him and eventually gave him his own spin-off series that is still running. He appears in more episodes than Rick, more episodes than Carol. He is the show's single, most consistent presence. And the theories about him are, I think, the most psychologically specific theories on this list. Because Daryl's story is not really about the apocalypse. The apocalypse is just the place where the story happens. Daryl's story is about what happens to a child who is formed entirely by violence and neglect, and what that person becomes when he finally finds something worth staying near. The interesting thing about Daryl as a character is that he wasn't designed to be this. He was, as I mentioned, a minor figure who was supposed to exit the show early. The writers weren't building toward a 12-season arc about trauma and belonging and the impossibility of going home when they wrote his first handful of episodes. And yet all of those themes are retrospectively legible in the earliest scenes, in the hair-trigger aggression, in the specific quality of his distrust, in the ways he orbits the group without ever quite joining it. Norman Reedus understood something about who Daryl was before the writers fully articulated it, and he played it from the beginning. By the time the show had decided to invest in him, the foundations were already there, which is either a testament to the performance or evidence that the best characters contain their own full biographies from the moment they appear on screen and simply wait for the story to catch up. The conventional reading of Daryl's arc is a redemption story. Rough, antisocial man discovers his capacity for loyalty and compassion through his bonds with the group. The apocalypse strips away his prejudices and his defensive aggression and reveals a person of genuine depth and moral seriousness underneath. It is a compelling arc, and the show earns it through small moments across many seasons. But there is a version of Daryl's story, equally supported by the evidence, arguably more supported, where the transformation is less complete than the conventional reading suggests, where Daryl hasn't actually changed the fundamental architecture of how he lives. He's just changed what he's running toward. Consider his behaviour in the middle seasons, when the group settles at Alexandria. Alexandria is the first genuinely comfortable environment the group has encountered. Electricity, running water, intact houses, a functioning community, the physical markers of normal life. Most members of the group, not all, but most, begin to integrate. They take houses, they take jobs, they participate in the social life of the community. Daryl does not. He sleeps on the porch of the group's shared house for days after arrival, unshowered, unwilling to engage with any of the community's structures described by other characters, with affectionate exasperation as feral. He resists Alexandria, not because it isn't safe, but because the kind of belonging it offers is the kind he doesn't know how to inhabit. He trusts a wall when he's built it himself, or when he's scouted it personally. He trusts a community when its dangers are ones he can navigate alone. Communities that ask him to participate as a citizen rather than as a protector put him somewhere he doesn't have an instinct for. This pattern persists. Daryl is always at the perimeter. Scout, tracker, hunter. He is the person who goes outside the walls, who operates in the space between what's safe and what's dangerous. He is never a resident. He is always the guardian of the threshold. And here is the moment I keep coming back to, because it's not a fan theory at this point. It's something the show wrote into the text explicitly. In Season 3 of the Daryl Dixon spinoff series, after everything Daryl has been through in France, he has a conversation with Carol in which he admits, plainly, that he started running when he was a child and has never really stopped. He can see the pattern. He names it. He acknowledges it as a habit, as something ingrained deep enough that even when he finds something good, the urge to keep moving never entirely goes away. That's not a healed person. That is a person with enough self-awareness to understand what's wrong, who isn't sure how to change it, and who suspects he might not be able to. The show wrote that in deliberately. The writers are telling you, Daryl's arc is not the one you thought it was. The theory is not that Daryl is broken. It's something more nuanced than that. It's that Daryl was shaped so completely by flight, by the necessity of always moving, always escaping, always having the exit mapped, that even when the thing he wants most is to stay, the body doesn't quite believe it's allowed. He didn't find home. He found people worth staying near the edge of, which is, if you think about it, its own kind of love. Just a very particular and very sad kind. There's a scene in the Season 4 episode Still, the episode where Daryl and Beth spend a day together, clearing out a country club and getting drunk on whatever they can find, where Beth pushes Daryl persistently to tell her about his life before, what he did, who he was. And Daryl resists for most of the episode, deflecting, going quiet, doing the things he does when a conversation gets too close to something he doesn't want examined. When he finally does talk, it is not about anything remarkable. He was nobody, he says. He just followed Merle around. He didn't have a plan. He didn't have a direction. He was just going from one place to the next. The way Norman Reedus delivers that admission is the performance that the whole theory hangs on for me, because it is not said with self-pity. It is said with a kind of baffled honesty, like Daryl is discovering this fact about himself in the moment of saying it, like he's hearing his own story for the first time and noticing that it sounds like someone who was never quite sure they were supposed to be anywhere. And the question the theory asks is, did that change? Did it actually change? Or did the group just become the new direction, the new thing to follow, the new motion that makes the constant movement feel like it has a purpose rather than admitting that the movement itself is all there is? Merle Dixon. Racist, aggressive, volatile, cruel in ways that are sometimes theatrical and sometimes genuinely frightening. He is the show's first human obstacle, the person who creates the handcuff problem on the rooftop in Atlanta that echoes across several seasons. He is difficult to like, and the theory about him is not that Merle was secretly a good person underneath the surface presentation. The evidence for that is thin, and the show is too honest to manufacture it. The theory is about what Merle represents in the architecture of Daryl's psychological life. Specifically, Merle is the person Daryl was always one decision away from becoming, and Daryl knew it. Here's what we know about their childhood. Their father was physically abusive. Their mother died in a house fire when they were young, caused by a cigarette while she was presumably drunk in the family trailer. Merle, being the older brother, absorbed a significant amount of the violence that their father directed at the household. He did this intentionally in at least one documented instance. The flashback we get in the Daryl Dixon spinoff shows young Merle telling young Daryl to run, telling him he can take it, that Daryl shouldn't worry. Merle stepped between Daryl and their father and took the beating. And then, when Merle turned 18, he left. He joined the military. He got out. He didn't take Daryl with him. He didn't know, when he left, the full extent of what Daryl would suffer afterward. But Daryl was left behind, and the scars on his back, revealed in Season 3, physical evidence of the abuse that continued after Merle's departure, are what that abandonment produced. Merle became everything their environment was designed to create. The violence, the aggression, the racism, the contempt. These are not character flaws in some abstract sense. They are the specific outputs of a specific upbringing. Merle absorbed the trauma and reproduced it outward. He became his father's child. What Daryl did over the course of the show was choose not to, not immediately, not cleanly. The early Daryl is still marked by everything Merle represents. The volatility, the distrust, the hair-trigger readiness for conflict. But slowly, episode by episode, he makes different choices. He is patient with Sophia when she's lost. He is gentle with Beth when she's fragile. He holds Judith with a care that reads as something the character himself doesn't quite have language for. He is the person who treats the most vulnerable members of the group with the most tenderness, consistently. Across the whole run of the show, every single one of those qualities and the gentleness, the patience, the care with the vulnerable was precisely the set of qualities that Merle mocked in him. Rick's bitch. Soft, the language Merle used against Daryl's gentler instincts, was the language of their upbringing, deployed to toughen Daryl into the shape the world expected him to take. Every time Daryl chose differently from Merle, he was defying that expectation. Merle's death is the moment this theory crystallizes. Daryl finds Merle as a walker in Season 3 and has to put him down. He falls apart in a way we almost never see from him. Raw grief, ugly crying, the kind of distress that doesn't have dignity. And I think the theory helps explain why the grief is that specific and that profound. He's not just mourning a brother. He's mourning the last living person who witnessed who he was before he decided to be different. With Merle alive, there was always someone who remembered the Daryl that existed in that trailer in North Georgia, the scared kid following his older brother around, the person who hadn't yet made the choices that made him who he became. With Merle dead, that witness is gone. The choice Daryl made to be something other than what he was raised to be has no one left to contradict it. He won, and there is grief in winning sometimes that is indistinguishable from loss. The other dimension of this that the spin-off series excavates carefully is what Daryl does with that grief across the decades that follow. He doesn't memorialize Merle formally. He doesn't speak about him readily. He keeps Merle's memory the way he keeps most things that matter to him, close, private, rarely named. But the choices Daryl makes in the years after Merle's death are all, in some sense, the choices Merle would have made differently. He stays with communities he doesn't entirely trust rather than cutting loose. He protects children with a ferocity that has no tactical justification. He forms bonds with people who, by the logic of the man he was raised to be, would have been categorized as liabilities. He does this, the theory suggests, because Merle is gone, and there is nobody left to mock him for it. The defiance that his gentleness always was, the quiet ongoing act of refusing to become what his environment designed him to be, no longer has an audience, and so it becomes simply who he is rather than who he is in opposition to someone. The choice calcified into character, not resolution exactly, just practice long enough and consistent enough that the practice became permanent. If you have a friend who's never watched The Walking Dead and you need to explain Carol Pelletier to them, the simplest version goes something like this. She starts the show as a quiet, withdrawn woman in an abusive marriage, and she ends the show as probably the most strategically dangerous person in the entire franchise. The transformation is the most dramatic arc the show produces, and the show is justifiably proud of it. But sitting with Carol's story long enough, across all the seasons and all the choices and all the versions of herself she presents to different people, at different times, a different shape starts to emerge. Not one that undermines the transformation, but one that suggests the transformation is more complicated than the show's surface narrative acknowledges, and honestly, more interesting. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this and you haven't subscribed yet, now's a good moment to do that. It helps the channel tremendously, and you won't have to go looking for the next one. Ed Pelletier, Carol's abusive husband. He is in the show for a handful of episodes before he is killed, and in those episodes, the pattern of their relationship is established clearly. Carol is quiet. Carol keeps her head down. Carol absorbs the insults and the physical violence and produces the minimum possible surface area for his anger to land on. She makes herself small in a very particular way, not the smallness of a person who has nothing to offer, but the smallness of a person who has learned that being visible is dangerous. She performs helplessness because helplessness, with Ed, was the safest available role. This is not a new observation. The show is fairly explicit about it. What the theory does is follow this pattern forward, past Ed's death and into the seasons that follow, and ask whether it ever actually stops. At the quarry camp, Carol continues to occupy the background character role. She does laundry. She tends the domestic logistics of the camp. She is, in the social economy of the group, essentially invisible. People underestimate her completely, which, as it turns out, is a condition Carol can navigate very fluently. At the prison, in season 3 and 4, she begins to show more of herself. She teaches children to use weapons in secret, correctly reasoning that the group's de facto adults won't authorize it, but that the children need to know. She takes on medical learning from Herschel. She develops relationships of genuine depth with Daryl, with Tyrese, with the younger members of the group. And then she kills Karen and David, 2 prison residents who are sick with an illness that's spreading, in order to contain the infection. Alone, without telling anyone. She burns their bodies. When Rick finds out and confronts her, the mask shifts. He exiles her. It is the first time in the show where Carol's real operational logic becomes visible to someone with the authority to act on it, and the result is removal from the community. And then comes Alexandria. And here is the moment that the theory pivots on. Carol arrives at Alexandria and constructs, from scratch, the most sophisticated deception in the show's run. She builds an entirely new persona. Cardigans, casseroles, gentle complaints about the neighbours. She presents as the group's most harmless member, confused by the new world's requirements, grateful for the safety, entirely unthreatening. The Alexandrians accept this presentation completely. While she's doing this, she is systematically mapping the community's weapon storage locations. She's cataloguing who can fight and who can't. She is assessing vulnerabilities and exit routes. She is, in operational terms, conducting an intelligence assessment of the community that is protecting them, in case she and the group ever need to take it. This is not someone who has overcome their trauma, This is someone who has applied the skill set they developed in the service of survival, which was the survival of an abusive marriage, to a vastly larger set of tactical problems. The performance of smallness that kept her alive with Ed is the same performance, refined and extended, that keeps the group safe in Alexandria. The theory is that there has never been a version of Carol that wasn't, in some sense, a performance, not because Carol isn't real or doesn't have genuine feelings. She clearly does, and the show is very honest about the cost of carrying what she carries. But because the habits of concealment are so deep and were laid down so early that the authentic version of Carol and the performed version of Carol have long since become impossible to distinguish. Even for her, there's one possible exception, and the theory holds it loosely. Daryl. The moments between Carol and Daryl that read as unguarded, genuinely unguarded, not strategically unguarded, are a specific texture in the show. Brief, incomplete, always just short of saying the whole thing, but there. Even that she kept limited. One wonders whether it was by choice or by habit. The Alexandria performance is worth dwelling on for a moment because of how completely it works, and because of what it implies about the people being deceived. The Alexandrians are not stupid. They are survivors. They have, by the point Carol arrives, been maintaining their community for years, screening new arrivals, evaluating threats. They have a functioning security apparatus, and they have been let down by it before. And Carol walks in and has them completely within 2 episodes. This says something about the performance, obviously, but it also says something about what the performance was constructed around. Carol understood, specifically and accurately, what a sheltered community most wants to believe about the people it welcomes in. It wants to believe they are grateful. It wants to believe they are ordinary. It wants to believe that the woman who appears to be exactly what she presents, a scared, overwhelmed housewife who just needs a bit of safety and structure, is exactly what she presents. Carol gave them what they wanted to see, and they saw it, because seeing it made them feel safe in the way a sheltered community needs to feel safe. The trap is not ignorance. The trap is the desire for a particular version of the world to be true, and Carol is very, very good at identifying that desire in other people and giving it exactly what it needs. This is the theory that the show actually builds very carefully across many seasons, while never quite naming it directly, and it's the one that I find hardest to sit with, which is probably why it's the one I keep thinking about. Ed Pelletier was abusive. He controlled Carol through the threat and use of physical violence. He made unilateral decisions about what happened in their household, about what Carol was permitted to do, who she was permitted to see, what consequences would follow from behaviour he disapproved of. He justified all of this in the internal logic of abusive men as protection, as maintaining order, as doing what needed to be done for the household's safety, which in his framing meant his own comfort and dominance. Now, Season 4, the flu is spreading through the prison. It's moving fast. People are dying. Carol determines, alone, without telling anyone, without seeking consensus, that the 2 people most likely to spread the infection to others are Karen and David. She makes the decision to kill them. She kills them. She burns their bodies. She did not ask permission. She did not consult the community. She decided, on her own authority, who should live and who should die in order to protect the group. Rick's reaction when he discovers this is visible shock, a particular kind of shock. Not the shock of learning someone has done something unexpected, but the shock of learning that someone you trusted has been operating according to a logic you didn't know about. He exiles her. The word the show uses is exile, which is the language of a community removing a threat. This is, structurally and emotionally, the same dynamic as the Ed dynamic. Rearranged, redistributed among different roles, with Carol now on the side with the operational power rather than the side receiving its effects. But the architecture is the same. One person decides unilaterally what is best for the community. enforces it through violence, conceals it until they can't, and then faces the community's judgment. The fire detail is the one that keeps pulling at me. Carol burns Sophia's body. Carol burns Karen and David's bodies. Carol burns the Terminus compound in Season 5, the act that saves the group. Carol sets fire to the barn. Fire appears again and again as her emotional signature, the thing she reaches for when the situation is beyond ordinary solutions, and she needs something that erases rather than defeats. Their mother died in a house fire. The fire was caused by a cigarette while their mother was drunk or asleep. Careless, accidental, the kind of death that makes no sense because it required no intention. Fire destroyed Carol's original family, and Carol, in the new world, uses fire as her primary tool of protection. She inherited the thing that destroyed her. She made it hers. There is an episode, The Grove, Season 4, that is by most accounts the most devastating single episode the show produced. Carol has to kill Lizzie, a child she has effectively adopted, after Lizzie kills her younger sister, Mika, in an attempt to demonstrate that walkers are still people. Carol takes Lizzie outside, tells her to look at the flowers, and shoots her in the back of the head. She makes the decision alone. She executes it alone. She buries the bodies. Look at the flowers is now the line most associated with Carol Pelletier. It is how people know her, if they know her at all outside the show, and the theory says that moment is not Carol doing something monstrous in a monstrous world. That moment is Carol becoming Ed. One more time, in one more form, the survivor of violence becoming its instrument. Doing what needs to be done for the group's safety, which in this moment means deciding unilaterally that a child's life is over. The show knows this, it's careful about it. Carol's arc keeps returning to this recognition. Her repeated exiles, her withdrawals from the group, her guilt, her seeking of solitude, these are not just grief. They are a person who keeps recognizing the thing inside herself that she hates and keeps failing to either remove it or accept it. She cannot bear what she has become. She also cannot stop being it, because in this world, being it is what keeps the people she loves alive, which is, of course, exactly what Ed would have told her once upon a time. It's worth noting, because the show earned this, that Carol's arc does eventually arrive at something approaching honest reckoning. Not resolution, not healing in the tidy sense, but recognition. There's a Season 10 sequence where Carol hallucinates Alpha, the Whisperer leader she arranged to have killed, and Alpha's voice, in the hallucination, says the things Carol most fears about herself. That she is cold, that she ruins the people around her, that she uses people and calls it protection, that she has become exactly the kind of person she was afraid of when she was still a woman in a bad marriage, who didn't know any of the things she knows now. Carol doesn't deny it. That's the thing that makes the scene work. She doesn't construct a counter-narrative. She sits with it. And then she gets up and goes back to the people she loves anyway, carrying all of it, unchanged but not unconscious, knowing what she is, choosing to be it anyway, because the alternative, not being the person who does the things that need doing, would mean the people she loves die without that protection. There are worse tragedies than that. The show produces several. But Carol's particular tragedy, the trappedness of it, the way every act of love and every act of violence are woven together into a single, impossible knot, is one of the most elegantly written in the franchise, even if the show never said it in those terms. There's an argument to be made that Morgan Jones is the show's most structurally important minor character. He appears in 3 episodes in Season 1. He disappears entirely for 2 full seasons. He reappears in Season 3 in a state of profound psychological disintegration, alone in the town Rick came from, surrounded by traps and writing-covered walls, a man the apocalypse has apparently broken. He eventually returns, finds something like stability through a philosophy he adopts from another survivor, and spends several seasons cycling between that stability and the violence that keeps undoing it. the show treats Morgan as a figure of genuine philosophical weight. He and Carol have the franchise's most substantive arguments about the ethics of survival. He is the character who most consistently challenges the group's assumptions about what the apocalypse requires of them. And he is, the theories suggest, the character whose inner life the show most consistently misattributes. The show's reading of Morgan's deterioration is grief-based. He lost Dwayne, his son, to his Walker wife, Jenny. He was alone for years. The isolation and the loss combined to produce the mental state we find him in during Clear, the Season 3 episode that stands as one of the show's most acclaimed hours. That reading is emotionally coherent, and the performance supports it. But there is an earlier moment that the theory builds from. Season 1, Episode 1. Rick finds Morgan and Dwayne in King County. Morgan is stable, resourceful, careful. He's identified a safe house, established perimeter detection, created a functioning shelter for himself and his child. He is, by the pilot's standards, one of the most competent survivors in the episode. And then the night comes, and Morgan sits at the window with a rifle, watching through the scope as his wife Jenny walks through the neighborhood below. She is a walker. She has been a walker, it's implied, for some time. He has had opportunities to take the shot. He is, demonstrably, a competent marksman. He cannot do it. This is not presented as a one-time failure. It happens night after night. Morgan sits at that window and cannot pull the trigger. And the theory's starting point is that this is not a grief response to a new loss. This is a pre-existing psychological condition, an inability to translate intention into lethal action against someone he loves, that predates the apocalypse by years, possibly decades, that the apocalypse simply put on visible display. The pilot handles this carefully. Lenny James plays the scene with real specificity. There is something in Morgan's face when he describes Jenny, when he talks about watching her from the window. That is not just grief. It is the particular expression of a person who has already had the argument with themselves many times and lost it every time. He knows the shot is available. He knows what the shot would accomplish. He knows that the logical, the humane, the practical thing to do is to take it. He picks up the rifle. He looks through the scope. He lowers the rifle. He cannot explain this. He says he knows what he needs to do, and he can't do it. He describes this as weakness. The theory says it is not weakness. It is a structural limit that runs deeper than the situation can reach. This distinction matters because the show's reading, grief, implies that Morgan would have been fine if Dwayne had survived, if Jenny had been put down in time, if the circumstances had been different. The theory's reading implies that Morgan was always going to end up in some version of that room, that the specific shape of his breakdown, the isolation, the philosophy, the cycling, was always going to emerge given enough pressure, because the pressure revealed something that was present before any specific loss occurred. A person who is grieving a partner can still, under sufficient duress, do what survival requires. A person who is constitutionally unable to harm someone they love in ways that run deep enough that no amount of crisis can override the refusal. That's a different kind of damage. And the damage predates Jenny's death. Jenny's death just removed the last buffer between Morgan and the question of who he fundamentally is. The cycling, the pendulum between total pacifism and terrible violence that defines his middle seasons, is then not a process of moral evolution. It is the oscillation of a person who cannot find a stable position because neither extreme is truly what he wants to be, and the underlying wound that produces the oscillation is not one the show's events created. It was already there. The apocalypse just stopped him from hiding it. Here is where the theory gets a bit precise. Morgan's pacifism, at its core, is not actually about other people's lives. It is about his own capacity for violence, and what that capacity means about who he is. The philosophy of all life is precious is not a position he adopts about the value of others. It is a constraint he places on himself, a structure built to keep the violence from getting out. because when it gets out, he cannot control it and cannot forgive himself for it. Eastman, the man who gives Morgan this philosophy in the Season 6 episode, Here's Not Here, or is not healing Morgan's grief. He's providing a framework, a theological system that Morgan can use to rebuild a functional life around his existing psychological structure. It works for a while. It gives Morgan something to say when the violence knocks on the door. Not today. I have a reason to say not today. But a framework is not a cure. When true pressure returns, say, when the people Morgan loves are threatened in ways that the framework cannot accommodate, the framework cracks, and what comes through is the same thing that was always there. Not the apocalypse's creation, it's revelation. This one is more uncomfortable, but the evidence for it, in Clear specifically, is too dense to ignore. When Rick finds Morgan in King County in Season 3, Morgan has spent years alone. He has filled the building he's holed up in with traps, elaborate, clearly time-consuming constructions that cover the streets and the surrounding area. He has written on every available surface biblical quotes, names, instructions. The writing covers walls, ceilings, floors. The interior of the building is a complete record of Morgan's mental activity across an unknowable stretch of time. A person in crisis, a grieving person, a traumatized person, does not construct this. This is the behavior of someone who is trying to fill every available moment with evidence of their own continued existence, who is fighting every day against the pull towards stopping. The traps are not defensive fortifications, they are projects, things to build, to maintain, to occupy the mind that would otherwise go somewhere it cannot come back from. Morgan has been building his own reason to keep existing, one trap at a time. When Morgan attacks Rick in that building, he is not fighting to protect himself. He is trying to get Rick to end it. The ferocity of the attack, directed at a man Morgan recognizes, a man he showed mercy to in the pilot. This is not self-defense. This is provocation. This is a man trying to arrange his own death at the hands of someone else because he cannot quite bring himself to do it directly. Eastman arrives and declines to oblige this. He captures Morgan rather than killing him. He says, "You have to find a reason to live." And he gives Morgan the philosophy. The all life is precious framework, if you examine it, as Morgan applies it, functions primarily as a prohibition against Morgan's own death. He uses it to decline to kill enemies, but the deeper operation is, he uses it to decline to die, to decline to allow himself to be killed in an act of managed suicide, to decline to become expendable, to decline to be the one life in the framework that doesn't count. The behavioural evidence across his later seasons supports this. When Morgan eventually kills, the wolf he shoots to save Carol in the prison, the saviours in Season 7, he consistently does it in darkness, alone, hidden from other characters. He kills in the way a person hides something shameful. He doesn't want to be seen committing these acts because being seen committing them collapses the story that is keeping him here. Morgan's arc, read this way, is not about violence versus peace as external ethical positions. It is about a man who keeps finding, just barely, just in time, enough reason to remain in the world. The philosophy is the reason this week. The people he loves are the reason next month. The mission gives him the reason after that. He is perpetually constructing justifications for his own continued existence, and when one construction fails, the oscillation begins again, and the next construction has to be built quickly, or the gap between them becomes dangerous. Lenny James, who plays Morgan, has said in interviews that he thinks of the character as someone who is always in recovery, not from a specific addiction or a specific loss, but from himself, from the version of himself that the hardest circumstances tend to produce. And I think that framing, which aligns more or less perfectly with the theory, is actually the most compassionate reading available. Morgan is not tragic because he's broken. He is tragic because he is aware of being broken and aware that the awareness is not sufficient to fix it and keeps going anyway. one reason at a time, one day at a time. The way that people who are genuinely struggling, not dramatically, not cinematically, but quietly and continuously, actually tend to do it. This is, I think, a more honest reading of Morgan than the show's surface narrative provides, and it makes him not a supporting character in a story about ethics, but a person fighting a war that the apocalypse didn't create and couldn't solve. A war entirely internal, entirely continuous, that the audience mostly only glimpsed in the spaces between his more legible struggles. Morgan's eventual departure for Texas and the Fear the Walking Dead storyline is interesting to view through this lens. He leaves because the world around him, the specific community, the specific people, has shifted in ways he cannot metabolize anymore, and he rebuilds in Texas the same structure he always builds. Relationships, purpose, a reason. He finds people to protect and a philosophy to protect them with. He does it again because he has always done it again. Whether that constitutes resilience or simply the exhausting work of staying alive against a persistent internal current is left to the audience to decide. The show doesn't resolve it. Morgan doesn't resolve it. He just keeps going, which is perhaps the most honest ending the character could have. Not healed, not broken, not transformed. Just continuing, one reason at a time, for as long as the reasons hold. Let me say something about Negan before we get into the theories, just to frame where we're starting from. Negan arrives in the Season 6 finale as the show's most dramatically constructed villain, introduced in a scene of sustained slow-building dread that runs for several minutes and culminates in a killing that the show deliberately withholds from the audience. He has a bat wrapped in barbed wire that he has named after his dead wife. He runs an organization called the Saviors that operates by collecting half the resources of subjugated communities. He is charismatic, theatrical, and capable of genuine cruelty. He is also, by Season 9, a redeemed supporting character. By Season 10, he is helping the heroes. By his own spin-off series, he is, to the bewilderment of a certain section of the audience, one of the people you're supposed to be rooting for. The transformation bothers a lot of fans, and I understand why. It feels like the show backing away from its own darkness, softening a character it had committed to fully. But the theories about Negan don't actually require you to accept the redemption arc. They ask you to look at who he was from the beginning, in ways the show didn't fully examine. This is the theory the show flirts with more than any other. It dances around it, acknowledges it in dialogue, then steps back from the full implications. But the full implications are worth sitting with. We've already traced the philosophical overlap between Rick and Negan back in Rick's section. The same logic, the same authority structure, the same founding document of unilateral leadership. I won't rebuild that argument here. What's worth examining with Negan specifically is what his version of the framework actually produced, measured against Rick's. The half your stuff tithe that the Saviors impose on subjugated communities is brutal in its execution. The violence used to enforce it is disproportionate and sadistic. No one who has seen Glenn's death is confused about this, but if you hold the Savior arrangement at a distance and ask what it actually accomplished in the show's universe, the communities that paid tribute to Negan were fed, protected from walkers by organized Savior patrols, and maintained. They were stable. After Negan's defeat and imprisonment, those same communities struggled with problems that his system had, at terrible cost, solved. There is a moment in Season 7 where a Savior community is shown from the inside. The workers, the internal hierarchy, the daily logistics, and it is not a concentration camp. It is an unpleasant and fear-governed community, certainly, but it functions. Resources are distributed, people survive. The Savior system produces outcomes that Rick's system, in the same period, is failing to produce. None of this is an apology for Negan. The murders are real. The psychological control is real. The cruelty is real. But the theory says, take Negan's methods and Rick's methods, hold them side by side, trace the philosophical genealogy, and the distance between the two men is significantly shorter than the show's framing suggests. Their war was not between good and evil. It was between two men with fundamentally identical psychological architecture, fighting over who got to be the one who said, "This is not a democracy anymore," and had everyone accept it. The show is aware of this. It's why the war storyline feels so flat when the expected moral clarity doesn't materialize. It's why audiences were confused when Negan's defeat didn't feel cathartic. The victory was supposed to feel like good triumphing over evil, and it didn't quite, because the show had spent too much time showing you that the good and the evil were the same person in different hats. This one requires the backstory, which the show provides in the episode Here's Negan, a Season 10 episode, told in flashback about who Philip Blake was before he became Negan. Lucille Smith was his wife. She was ill, cancer, diagnosed before the collapse, receiving treatment that the apocalypse interrupted. She died during the early outbreak, not from the infection, but from the illness that was already killing her, combined with the withdrawal of the medical infrastructure that had been managing it. She died in their home, with Negan present, and then Negan left her. He did not deliver the mercy that the show has established as the standard human duty, the thing you do for a person you love to prevent them from becoming a walker. He left her to reanimate. He did not kill his wife. He walked out of the room where she died and did not come back. Sometime later, the episode is not precise about the timeline, he found a bat. He wrapped it in barbed wire. He named it Lucille. Now, the standard reading of this is symbolic. Negan named the bat after his wife, as a tribute to her memory, or as an expression of his grief, or as an act of dark romanticism that fits his theatrical personality. The bat is powerful and dangerous, as Lucille was, as his love for her was. It's a metaphor, but the theory says it is not a metaphor to Negan. Here is the detail that anchors this. The Walking Dead establishes, very early and very explicitly, that walkers retain a kind of residual connection to their former selves. They return to familiar places. They respond to familiar sounds. They are not entirely gone. The person is in there, somewhere, diminished and unreachable, but present. The show uses this as a source of tragedy across many storylines. Morgan and Jenny, Herschel and his farm, the governor and Penny. The ones left behind keep calling to the ones who've turned. Negan does not believe Lucille is dead. He believes Lucille is transformed. He left her to transform because he could not bring himself to end the process, could not accept that death was the absolute, irreversible end he knew rationally it had to be. And then he built a weapon and named it after her because he believes, on some level that operates below his considerable intelligence and self-awareness, that she is in it, that carrying the bat is carrying Lucille, that when he swings it, she is swinging it, that she is still with him. The conversations he has with the bat throughout the show, and there are several private ones, not performed for an audience, are not affectation. They are the behaviour of a man in genuine communication with something he believes is there. The grief he expresses when the bat is destroyed at the hilltop in Season 8 is not performed. It is the grief of bereavement, specific and raw, not the frustration of a man who's lost a weapon. This is the theory that makes Negan, for me, the most human character in the franchise. Not a psychopath, not a monster in the traditional sense. A man who could not let go of the person he loved, who constructed an elaborate reality around that inability, who ruled a post-apocalyptic empire largely as a distraction from the thing he could not undo. He left her. He has never stopped punishing himself for leaving her. Every swing of the bat is the apology he cannot speak and she cannot hear, which is, honestly, one of the most human things in a show that is ostensibly about monsters. And it recontextualizes the Here's Negan episode in ways that I think make it richer than the show itself quite realized. That episode is often discussed as Negan's humanization, the backstory designed to make the audience sympathize with him before his redemption arc fully commits. and it functions that way. But it also contains a detail that the episode barely pauses on, which is that after Lucille dies, after Negan walks out of the room where she's reanimating, the next scene we get is him already in the Saviors. Already constructing the Empire, already becoming Negan. The grief work was instant and total. Philip Blake did not process the loss of his wife. He converted it. He wrapped it in wire and named it after her and put it to work. And the man who emerged from that room was Negan, not because the grief broke him, but because the grief was so complete, so overwhelming, that the only available response was to build something large enough to contain it. The Saviors are, in this reading, a monument to avoiding the feelings that the death of Lucille produced, a structure so large and so demanding that it leaves no room for the quiet, which is when the feelings would come. The Empire was his version of Morgan's traps, different in scale and in consequence, identical in function. There's a moment early in Season 7 when Negan arrives at Alexandria to collect tribute, and Daryl is there as his captive, and Rick is forced to stand and watch, where Negan speaks to the group and explains, at some length, the logic of the arrangement. He is calm, he is almost paternal. He is explaining with apparent sincerity that the Saviors are a solution to a problem rather than a cause of one. That without the Saviors, people die from walkers and from other groups and from the general chaos of the world. That with the Saviors, the communities that comply are protected and stable and alive. That the tribute is the cost of that stability, and the cost is worth it. What's interesting about the scene is that most of it is true, not all of it. Negan inflates his own necessity, as all powerful people do, but the structural claim is accurate enough. The communities that paid tribute were, on balance, safer than the communities that didn't. The Saviors provided a service. It was a brutal and coercive service, extracted through terror, but it was a service. Rick's counter-argument, the argument that motivates the war, is not that the arrangement is inefficient. It is that it is wrong, that no one should have to live under those conditions, that the dignity cost is too high regardless of the safety benefit. And that is a legitimate position. It is also, if you follow it through honestly, the position that leads to the war that kills Abraham and Glenn and many others in the fighting that follows. The dignity argument is right, and it is expensive. Negan, watching all of this, says, "I told you so," not out loud, but the logic says it. Michonne arrives in the show's third season as pure visual grammar, a figure in a hooded cloak, moving through a field of walkers without being disturbed, pulling two armless, jawless walkers on chains behind her. She's accompanied by a stranger. She does not explain herself. For several episodes, the show withholds almost everything about who she is and where she came from, and lets the image do the work. The image does a lot of work. The chains, the katana, the utter self-possession, the walkers on leads who shuffle behind her like defeated pets. There is something deeply unsettling about it, and also something impressive, and the combination is exactly the tone Michonne introduces herself with. She is someone who has found a solution. It costs something we can't quite identify yet, but it works. The theories about Michonne are both, in different ways, about the same underlying thing. The lengths a person will go to in order to avoid feeling what they cannot bear to feel. The lengths and the form those lengths take when the person constructing them is very intelligent and very capable and has the discipline to maintain enormous self-deception indefinitely. The show eventually tells us who the two walkers on chains were: Mike, her boyfriend, and Terry, his friend. They were part of a group of survivors that Michonne was with in the very early days of the outbreak. They were at a camp. Michonne left the camp to get supplies. The camp was overrun while she was gone. Andre, her son, her infant son, died in the attack. Mike and Terry survived but were bitten, and Michonne returned to find them in the process of turning. She did not kill them. She removed their arms and their lower jaws, rendering them incapable of biting, and kept them. As camouflage is the practical explanation. Walkers ignore walkers. A human accompanied by walkers reads to the rest of the horde as a walker. The camouflage explanation is real, and the show treats it as the primary one. The theory says it's not the primary one, it's the rationalization. You can use any walkers for camouflage. The walkers don't know who they were before. They're not anchored by affection to any particular person. Michonne could have found two anonymous walkers anywhere in the apocalypse and accomplished the same tactical goal. She chose Mike. She chose Terry. She walked out of the camp where her son died and came back and chose the people whose survival, in their compromised form, was the most visible evidence of the catastrophe she had caused. The theory: Michonne kept Mike and Terry because she needed to look at what she had done. Not metaphorically, literally, to walk beside it every day, to be forced into proximate contact with the evidence of her failure. Two people she knew, two people connected directly to the moment she made a decision that cost her son his life. And to do it indefinitely, as penance. Making them into tools was the only framework available for the act of staying near them. She couldn't keep them as companions. She couldn't bear to destroy them. So she transformed them into something functional, something practical, something she could keep without it looking like what it actually was. When she eventually cuts them loose and kills them, in the season 3-episode Clear at the abandoned bar, having just decided to open herself to Rick and the group, this is the scene the theory asks you to look at most carefully. She has just chosen to trust someone. She has just decided, for the first time in a long time, to form an attachment. And before she can do that, before she can allow herself to attach to living people again, she has to let go of the dead ones. She has to put down the penance. She has to give herself permission to stop being punished. It is a mercy killing for herself, conducted by proxy on two walkers who used to be people she knew. The detail about where this happens matters too. Clear is the episode centered on Morgan, on Rick's trip back to King County, on the discovery of Morgan's deterioration, on the question of what extended isolation and loss does to a person's ability to function. It is an episode about the cost of carrying the dead. Morgan has been literally building around himself, constructing an environment shaped entirely by his grief and his inability to let go. And in the middle of that episode, in a bar in a town full of ghosts, Michonne quietly and without ceremony puts down two of hers. The structural pairing is deliberate. Morgan's version of carrying the dead is visible, external, eccentric. Michonne's version is silent, invisible, completely contained. Both of them are carrying the same weight in fundamentally different ways, and the episode lets them sit in the same frame for a while. Not to compare them directly, but to let the audience feel the different textures of the same problem. After Rick's disappearance at the bridge, after the time skip, after the years of searching, Michonne reverts. She finds new walkers, keeps them chained. The cycle begins again, because grief has returned, and grief for Michonne has only one form she knows how to live inside. Guilt made operational, sorrow made structural, the dead kept close and made useful, because that is the only relationship with the dead she knows how to sustain. This one requires holding the post-bridge storyline at a particular angle. Bear with me. After Rick is swept away in the explosion, Season 9, the bridge sequence, Michonne searches. The show depicts the aftermath through a time jump, but the implication is clear. She spent years following leads, chasing rumours, refusing to accept that he was simply gone. 6 years pass between Rick's disappearance and the moment she finally receives the information, a phone recovered by Virgil, with evidence suggesting Rick survived the bridge, that draws her back into active searching and eventually away from the communities entirely. 6 years. She had children during those 6 years. She raised Judith. She raised RJ, the son she and Rick conceived, who Rick never met. She ran Alexandria at enormous personal cost, while simultaneously never fully committing to the belief that Rick was dead. Here is the thing about grief, and about the specific form grief takes in highly competent people who are also carrying guilt. It tends to find forms that look like action, that look like strength, that look from the outside like the appropriate response of someone who refuses to give up. The theory says Michonne already knew. On some level, the level that operates below the conscious decisions, the level that doesn't get to speak in ordinary moments, she already understood that Rick's survival at the scale required for him to return to her was unlikely. She is intelligent. She understands probability. She has seen enough death to understand what a bridge explosion means. But if she knows, she has to stop. And stopping means coming home. And coming home means being Michonne without Rick, being the mother, the leader, the person who holds Alexandria together, without the framework that made all of those roles feel sustainable. Rick was the anchor. Without him, she doesn't know if the anchor is her or if the anchor was him. So she searches, not because she doesn't believe he's gone, but because the searching is the last form of relating to him that doesn't require her to fully grieve him. The search is a relationship, a continuous, demanding, purpose-giving relationship with Rick's absence that keeps him functionally present in her life. While she's searching, she's still his. She's still them. She's still the person who loves him enough not to stop. The phone, Virgil's phone, with the evidence of Rick's boot prints, the things that finally confirm he was alive somewhere. The theory holds that the phone didn't give her hope. It gave her permission. She'd been waiting, perhaps unconsciously, for something that would allow her to stop searching without it being surrender, without it being acceptance, without it being the admission that she had known for 6 years and had been unable to bear the knowing. The phone gave her a reason to resume searching that was different from the desperate, holding-on searching of the years before. A specific lead, a direction, a thing to do that was not just the maintenance of grief, but the pursuit of information. She stopped being stuck in the way she had been stuck. She moved toward him, or toward the truth of him, with something like hope for the first time, because hope for Michonne requires a specific object. Generalized hope was never going to be enough. The ones who live eventually delivers what Michonne's story was always building toward. The reunion, the return, the rebuilding of the family the apocalypse nearly destroyed. And Danai Gurira plays the reunion with a texture that I think honors the theory. Michonne does not arrive relieved. She arrives in a way almost wary. Like someone who has spent 6 years in a particular emotional posture, a posture built around absence and pursuit and the discipline of continuing, and who now has to figure out who she is when the thing she was pursuing has been found. The reunion itself is earned. It is emotionally powerful by any measure, but there's a specific kind of difficulty in getting what you were looking for after years of not having it, and Michonne's face in those scenes carries that difficulty. She found him, and now she has to figure out who she is in a world where the search is over, which may be, quietly, the harder thing. And that might be the most honest thing the show ever said about what survival looks like after the immediate crisis is resolved. The drama is in the emergency. The hard living is in the afterwards, when the adrenaline has gone and the person you've been for 6 years of searching has to figure out whether they still know how to be anything else. Philip Blake, the governor of Woodbury, the man with the fish tanks full of walker heads, the gladiatorial arena, the captive daughter in the back room, the velvet manor, and the iron violence. He is the show's most fully constructed villain across the first 3 seasons, and he is the villain the show returns to in season 4 because it hasn't quite finished with him, because the story it was telling about him turns out to be larger than one season can hold. The governor is, in terms of sheer hours of engagement, probably the most examined antagonist the franchise has produced. His backstory is told in 2 episodes. His pre-apocalypse identity, the novel Rise of the Governor, which is official canon and tells you things the show only implies, adds another layer. And at the centre of all of it is a question the show raises, but doesn't resolve with the satisfaction you might expect. Was Philip Blake, at any point, a person who knew what he was? David Morrissey plays him with a particular quality that I think is essential to why the character works, as well as he does. A kind of warm, patient attentiveness that reads as genuine before it reads as threat. The governor listens. He makes eye contact. He asks about your family and remembers the answers. He is, in his community interactions, the person you'd most want to be running the place, right up until you understand what's in the back room, and what the arena is for, and why the people who ask too many questions tend to stop being visible. The charm is real. That's the thing. It is not performance. It is the expression of a man who genuinely believes he is the best available option for the people he leads, and who has found that genuine belief to be his most effective tool. The answer the theories provide is no, and the answer is more unsettling than yes would have been. This theory requires you to do something mildly uncomfortable, which is to try to reconstruct the governor's internal logic honestly. Not sympathetically. There's no obligation to sympathise with him. But honestly, Woodbury is functioning. That's the first thing to hold. Whatever the governor's methods, Woodbury is a town with electricity, medical care, regular food, social events, community infrastructure. By the standards of the apocalypse, by the standards of the quarry camp and the road, and the places the show uses to establish baseline survival conditions. Woodbury is advanced. It is organised. It provides something that most people in this world have lost: the possibility of an ordinary day. The cost of Woodbury is the governor, the gladiatorial arena which the governor runs as entertainment to maintain community morale and to process the psychological damage of prolonged survival. The external violence which the governor maintains against anyone who threatens the community's security. The particular brutality of his leadership, which is the mechanism that keeps the whole structure functional. The governor understands this cost precisely. He doesn't pretend it isn't there. He is not in denial about what he does. The theory is not that he fails to recognize the nature of his actions. The theory is that he has constructed a framework in which those actions are, within his moral calculus, justified. Not rationalized. That would imply some awareness of wrongdoing being suppressed. Actually, genuinely justified by a coherent internal logic that the governor experiences as simply being correct. His framework is, the protection of Woodbury is the highest moral priority. Anything that threatens Woodbury threatens the moral highest priority and must be neutralized. The means of neutralization are secondary to the goal. He is not a cruel person who found power. He is a pragmatist who decided that the protection of what he had built was worth almost any cost, and who discovered that he had a capacity for violence that made him effective at paying that cost. This is, with minor modifications, Rick's logic. It is Carol's logic. It is the logic that every survivor who has stayed alive long enough eventually produces. The governor arrived at it earlier and applied it more thoroughly, and the outcomes were more extreme. But the underlying ethical structure is one the show consistently suggests is the only ethical structure that actually functions. The parallel to Rick, which the show creates deliberately, is the one that makes this theory most uncomfortable. When Rick and the governor meet in Season 3 to negotiate, the show is constructing a mirror. Two men sitting across a table, both genuinely convinced of their own righteousness, both capable of terrible things in service of that conviction, both aware of each other as the primary threat to what they've built. The show wants you to see the difference between them. The theory says, look harder at the similarity. The governor doesn't lie to himself about who he is. He lies to other people, constantly and fluently. But internal to himself, in the fish tank room, with Penny and the Walker heads, and the quiet after everyone else has gone, there is no self-deception there. He knows what he is. He simply defines villain differently than you do. That's the most frightening kind of person. Not the one who hates himself for what he does, the one who doesn't. Penny Blake, Walker, approximately 7 years old when the show introduces her, kept in the governor's private apartment, chained, in a state of advanced decay, still wearing the remains of her clothes, and what her father still calls her name. The show wants you to see this as the last remnant of Philip Blake's humanity, the thing that survived intact or in some damaged, wrong form when everything else was consumed by the governor's increasing brutality. He was a father. He could not give up his daughter. The love was genuine, and the loss was unbearable, and so he kept her even in this form, because letting her go would mean accepting that she was completely gone. The theory says the love was genuine, and Penny was not primarily a symbol of that love. Penny was the story Philip Blake was telling himself to justify existing as the governor. Follow the function. As long as Penny is present, as long as Philip goes into that room and feeds her and calls her by her name and sits with her, he has a reason that is not power, not control, not the pleasure of violence. He is a father protecting his child. Fathers do what is necessary for their children. Fathers make impossible choices and pay impossible costs, and the love that drives those choices is its own absolution. While Penny is alive, in whatever form alive means, Philip Blake has something innocent to stand behind. Penny cannot judge him. She cannot experience anything that happens outside that room. She cannot know what is done in her name. She is the perfect alibi, present, visible, producing a legible emotional narrative about why the terrible things are justified, and completely incapable of withdrawing that justification. The moment Michonne kills Penny, Season 3, the confrontation in the governor's apartment, is the moment the alibi is destroyed. And the governor's subsequent behaviour is instructive. He does not grieve the way a person grieves a child. He grieves the way a person grieves the loss of something they were depending on to sustain their self-image. The mask goes away. The rhetoric about protecting Woodbury, about the necessity of what he does, about being the person who makes the hard decisions, it recedes. What remains is operational, cold. The governor without the narrative. After Penny's death, his violence loses its civic justification. He attacks the prison not to protect Woodbury, but because he wants to destroy Rick. He loses Woodbury in the process. He loses the entire community he had built, in pursuit of a private act of vengeance that benefits no one. That the old governor, the one with Penny in the back room, the one with a story to tell about why he was doing all of this, would never have permitted himself. The mask was the love, not a mask over the love. The love was the mask, and without it, the thing underneath had no more use for the structures that had contained it, which is possibly the show's darkest statement about parental love. Delivered by way of a man who couldn't let his daughter go, the love was real, and the love was a lie. Both things, simultaneously, without resolution. The Season 4 episodes that follow the governor through his brief, strange attempted reformation, those 2 episodes before his final assault on the prison, where he travels with a new family and tries on a version of Philip Blake that might have existed if the apocalypse had found him differently, make much more sense in light of this theory. He is not genuinely reforming in those episodes. He is auditioning a replacement structure. He is testing whether a new Penny, a new innocence, a new story about what he is protecting might be capable of doing the work the old story no longer can. There is a scene where he burns his photograph of his previous life and watches the smoke rise, and you could read this as genuine release, as Philip Blake choosing, finally, to let the past be the past. And perhaps for an hour or two, on a road somewhere in Georgia, with a new family looking to him for leadership, it was genuine. The show leaves the question deliberately open, but it doesn't hold, because the prison is there, because Rick is there, because the thing the governor built, Woodbury, the structure that gave his violence a civic justification, the community that made him something other than just a man doing terrible things, was taken. Rick didn't ask permission. Rick simply occupied the prison, and the governor, who had constructed his entire identity around the idea that he was the person who protected what mattered, cannot let that stand. The assault on the prison costs him the new family. It costs him Woodbury. It costs him everything he built a second time, in pursuit of a private act that the old governor, the one who still had Penny, the one who still had a story, would never have sanctioned. Because the old governor understood that the violence was supposed to serve the structure. Once the structure is gone, the violence has no purpose. It's just violence, and the man underneath it, stripped of every alibi and every story, has nothing left. He dies at the prison, stabbed, then finished. In the chaos of the battle, he started for reasons that had nothing to do with strategy or protection, and everything to do with the unbearable fact that Philip Blake, with or without Penny, without Woodbury, without the Empire, was nobody, just a man in a field, with nowhere to be the governor anymore. I want to pause for a moment before we move into the closing section, just to note something that I think connects all of these theories in a way that wasn't obvious to me until I had written most of them out. The Walking Dead is very good at two specific kinds of scene. It is good at the kind of scene where people do terrible things to each other in the name of survival, and it is good at the kind of scene where people sit quietly in the aftermath of terrible things and try to figure out who they still are. Still, the show is less good at the space between those two kinds of scenes. The ordinary life, the daily texture, the accumulated small moments that form the bulk of any real existence. It tends to skip over those. Time jumps, narrative ellipses, seasons end and seasons begin, and years have passed and the audience is invited to take on faith the relationships and changes that formed in the gap. What this means practically is that the characters' inner lives are always somewhat inferential. You're always working from what they say in the extreme moments, and from the choices they make in the crises, and from the specific reactions they have to specific provocations. And from all of that, you are constructing a model of who they are when the camera is not on them, which is, in a sense, exactly what fan theories do. They take the visible evidence and ask, what continuous inner life would produce these specific outputs? What version of this person, running constantly underneath the story, would generate these particular choices in these particular moments? The theories we've gone through tonight are all, in different ways, answers to that question. The coma, the secret pragmatist, the man still running, the woman still performing, the man building traps to stay alive, the man carrying his dead wife to every fight, the woman making penance walk beside her, the man whose love was his alibi. None of these explanations are simpler than the show's official versions. Most of them are considerably more complicated, but they fit the evidence more precisely in ways that feel less like clever interpretation and more like recognition, like something that was always there, visible from a slightly different angle, that you suddenly can't unsee once you've seen it. The best fan theories do this. They don't invent, they notice. And they notice things the show put there, whether it meant to or not, in the specificity of a performance or the choice of a prop or the timing of a death or the exact wording of a line delivered at 2 a.m. on a set in Georgia. 11 seasons of material. Enough for anyone paying close attention to find the story underneath the story. So, 16 theories, 8 characters. We've covered most of the main cast and the theories have covered a lot of ground. Comas and alibis and inherited instincts and systems of grief built to look like something more functional. We're somewhere past the 2-hour mark, I imagine, for anyone who's been listening from the start. Or perhaps you've been drifting in and out, catching pieces here and there, which is entirely the point. These kinds of long, slow deep dives are built to be slept into and out of. The details don't require linear attention. They accumulate at whatever pace works for the person on the other end. If you're still here and still awake, thank you. That's a significant amount of company. There is a through line to all of these theories, something that connects Rick's coma to Negan's bat to Morgan's traps, to Michonne's walker chains. And I think it's worth naming before we finish. It is this. Every single character on this list was already changed before the walkers arrived. The apocalypse didn't create these people. It revealed them. It removed the structures, legal, social, financial, relational, that were containing them, and it let whatever was always underneath step forward into the daylight. Rick's capacity for violence was there before the first episode. Shane's pragmatism and its costs were there before the coma. Daryl's flight response was formed years before anyone knew what a walker was. Carol's performance of smallness predates the collapse of civilization by however many years she spent in that marriage. Morgan's internal oscillation was already running, quietly, in the background of a normal life, waiting for something that would bring it to the surface. This is one of the things that the show was genuinely insightful about, even in its weaker periods. It understood that the apocalypse is not the origin of who people are. It is the context in which they become visible. The walkers are not what makes this story frightening. What makes it frightening is the recognition that the people, us effectively, in this thought experiment, were already carrying everything they needed to do what they did. The apocalypse just gave them the occasion. The Negan question is the one I keep returning to, because it is the one the show never quite settled. If Rick and Negan are, at a philosophical level, operating from the same framework, if the distance between them is a matter of degree and circumstance rather than fundamental character, then what does the show's nominal resolution mean? Rick wins, Rick's side prevails. But the show's own spin-offs then immediately begin depicting the struggles and failures of the communities Rick built, the ongoing necessity of exactly the kind of hard-edged pragmatism that the show associated with villainy when Negan embodied it. The victory produces instability. The piece is difficult and costly and incomplete, which is honestly probably correct, which is probably the most accurate thing the show could have said about how civilizations get built and sustained. Not by good people overcoming evil people, by imperfect people, carrying everything their histories made them carry, making choices under pressure that they can't fully evaluate in the moment, trying to hold things together for one more day. The walkers in the show are famously described in production notes and creator interviews as metaphors for consumerism, for mindless conformity, for the crowd. All of those readings exist and all of them are legitimate, but I think the most honest reading, especially after sitting with these theories, is simpler. The walkers are the people who ran out of reasons, who lost the thing, the family, the mission, the grief, the love, the philosophy, the bat, that was keeping them on the right side of whatever line separates the living from the dead. Not literally, but in the sense that matters. Morgan stayed alive because he kept finding reasons. Carol stayed alive because she kept finding people to protect. Daryl stayed alive because he kept finding something to run toward rather than away from. Michonne stayed alive because she kept constructing a version of hope specific enough to act on. And Rick, whatever he was, whatever he became, however far the spiral went, stayed alive because at the center of everything was the simple, stubborn, somewhat irrational conviction that his family was worth all of it. That keeping Carl and Judith and Michonne and the people they had built a world with was worth any cost the story asked him to pay. The coma theory, if you accept it, gives that conviction an additional layer of pathos. If he's been asleep since the beginning, if all of this is a dream, then the stubborn love at the center of the dream is the truest thing in it. The man who couldn't be woken was not constructing a fantasy of victory. He was constructing a fantasy of belonging, of being needed, of mattering to specific people in specific ways, of the ordinary, domestic, imperfect love that the apocalypse destroyed in the real room and preserved forever in the dream. And if the dream has been running for over a decade, if the world of the show and the hospital room in King County exist somehow simultaneously, then the dreamer has, against all odds, built something worth dreaming. A world where people fight and fail and hurt each other and lose people they love and get back up and keep going. Not because the world is good, because the specific people in it are worth the getting back up. Which is, if you follow it all the way through, not a dark theory at all, it's just a theory about what love looks like when the structures around it are gone, and the only thing left is the thing itself. Right, that's all 16. I hope some of it found you somewhere comfortable, and I hope the rest of the night is quiet and soft, and whatever you needed it to be. If you enjoyed this one, do subscribe. It genuinely helps the channel, and it means the next one will find its way to you without any effort on your part. I'll be back with another one before too long. Sleep well.